Nerds, geeks, sweaties. Look how far we've come. We rule the world. But it wasn't always this way. Let's go back to a time when there was no comic book cinematic universe, when you had to wait 3 years to get a superhero movie. Back to a time when Batman used a credit card. This is a film about a superhero movie that didn't get made. In 1998, a movie called Superman Lives was in production. It was going to be directed by Tim Burton and star Nicolas Cage as Superman. I've been fascinated with this since I first heard about it. From the concept design to the various scripts to the people involved, this would have been the most craziest cosmic Superman movie ever made.
What do you think the Superman Lives movie that Tim Burton and Nicolas Cage were going to make, what do you think that movie would have been like?
Nicolas Cage is probably one of our generation's definitive actors.
I don't know if he'd be able to pull it off or not, but it would have been interesting. It's one of those, you know, what ifs.
I saw some of the artwork, and it just didn't fly with me.
There's nothing about his face that fits. Nothing about his voice that fits that deep Superman voice that you can trust. It just seems kind of hilarious. I'm like, I'm sorry, guy, no.
Nicolas Cage is a great actor, so I think he could have played that really well.
You know, when we all watched George Reeves and I watched Christopher Reeve, I wasn't like, that's George Reeves, Chris Reeve. It was Superman. Nick Cage, you're like, that's Nick Cage as Superman.
Nick Cage would have been awesome. I mean, it's still one of my favorites is Wild at Heart with him.
Yeah.
I just figure that guy as Superman would be awesome.
The attempts to make superhero movies in the 90s weren't particularly successful, I felt. Dick Tracy did the same, or the Joel Schumacher Batman movies did the same, with the costumes super bright and primary coloured, and the idea of trying to create what a comic would look like on screen. I mean, obviously it would have been interesting to see. It would have been pretty weird to see Nicolas Cage as Superman.
Superman Lives was basically written by 3 different screenwriters, Kevin Smith, Wesley Strick, and Dan Gilroy. All 3 scripts revolved around the same story, basically taken from the comic book series The Death of Superman, where Superman fought the villains Lex Luthor, Brainiac, and the killing machine Doomsday. Doomsday killed Superman in the comic books, and then he came back to life using Kryptonian technology. This revitalized the comic book series. Warner Brothers took their cue from the comic books to revitalize their movie franchise.
On the set of Superman Returns, at any moment in Video Village, Brian had sort of a little, it was like a little binder. No one could really touch it. And inside, he had this photograph of Nicolas Cage from Tim Burton's aborted version of Superman.
Oftentimes we'll be in studio executive meetings and people will bitch about the fact that Brandon Routh's costume is so similar to the comics, that it has the underwear, that it looks a little kitschy. And so Brian, whenever that would happen in a meeting, would snap his fingers and have his assistant pull out this photograph, and it would instantly shut them up.
He would reach over to Video Village, pick up his book, and he would say, you know, you guys were gonna make this. We're not making this.
Sometimes the interest in the what if is stronger than the actual final product, because it fills your mind with the possibilities of what could have been. That's something that interested me when I saw the concept art for Superman Lives. Amazing, strange designs, cosmic ideas, creatures, aliens, Superman with a strange metal S. All these things interested me, and I wanted to find out why it never got made.
Imagine a distant planet in a far-off star system, light years from here. We've never seen it in our telescopes, we know nothing about them, but they look a bit like us. A star that's in the last days of its life, and imagine that their planet is under threat of destruction. And those fantastic scientists say that there's only one thing they can do, and that's to send a child out into space who might carry the physical attributes and mental attributes that these people have engendered over the centuries. And imagine then that this child coming to Earth suddenly is gifted with powers that come from the great society that gave birth to him. And he not only brings those powers, but he brings a morality. Just imagine what he could do to our world with the aim of changing it and making us better.
Superman Lives, or Superman Reborn, and then Superman Lives, and then later Superman Returns, was meant to be kind of like, let's kickstart Superman again in a bit more earnest way. Not the like spit, curl, and wink of Chris Reeve and Dick Donner. They wanted a 90s version of Superman, even though when I was writing, all I was writing was Chris Reeve. I thought Bryan Singer's version forgot to like put in
action.
Yeah, like fucking, he didn't get to punch anybody. He punched an island. And then somebody pointed out that like Superman doesn't get to punch everything every movie. And I thought about it, and I looked back, and sometimes he didn't punch
He
shit.
fought some video game type things in Superman 3.
Fought good taste in Superman 3. Fought himself, remember?
Right. Turned purple and drinking whiskey, burning with peanuts.
Like, I could see why Bryan Singer was sucked into doing a quasi-sequel to the Dick Donner Superman movies. Those were our Superman movies. They were so fucking magical. Yeah. And they found a way to make them work where your parents could sit there and be like, yeah, all right, he's fighting General Zod, I get it. And they're not like, this is horse shit. You know, they're like, all right, I can get behind this. So, you know, there's a pull to it because it's the classic lore, and Dick Donner did such a great job with it.
Superman was something that I had seen with Dick Donner and I'd loved, and I was mesmerized by it. So that was the granddaddy of all the superheroes. I've made over 100 movies that I did with Polygram Pictures and all the movies that we produced and everything. I was the chairman of Sony and I was leaving. Peter and I were splitting up. And they said to me, you're not going to believe this, but we think Superman is available. So I got into negotiation with the Salkinds, their lawyers, because Warner Brothers had not picked up the option. They didn't know that. It was before computers. So they would have sent someone in a back room with a bing, 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 going through all these things. It's not on the computer, would be normally red flagged. I got a call from Terry Semel, who was the head of Warner Brothers, and said, we want you to come back to the studio. And I said, I'm working on something now, which is really what I want to do. I had made Batman. And he said, what? And I said, I think I bought the rights to Superman. He said, you idiot. Warner Brothers owns it. I own it. I said, no, you don't. Check. Came back and he said, you're right, you do.
You know, essentially, if you read my script for Superman Lives, it's like fan fiction. And fuck, I was so nascent in my career. I was 26 years old, 27 years old, 96, 97. So I sat down and met with a creative exec named Basil Iwanek. He goes, what would you think about Beetlejuice Goes Hawaiian? So I said, that exists? He's like, yeah, we've been trying to figure out Beetlejuice for years. I was like, what's to figure out? Burton cracked the code. He goes, well, you know, we've been trying to work on a Superman. And I was like, Superman? Like, that was no part of the meeting that I was going in for. It just came up in conversation. But he had given me the Superman script to take home. And, oh, good Lord, terrible title from the jump. Might as well have just said Superman remarketed for a new generation, you know? It was just not the Superman movie I ever would have imagined. There was a scene in it I remember specifically where Clark Kent's going to a psychiatrist and talking about, like, you know, having this I'm Superman conversation. And the psychiatrist is like, no, you're not. And this is something for a comic book fan, particularly at that time and place in my life. I was like, oh, why don't you just piss on the Gospels, fuck? You know, why don't you just make Jesus do dick jokes? This is ridiculous. Why not just reach out to the guys who do the comic books? They would get it. This guy don't get it. And he goes, yeah, but those guys are comic book guys. I swear to you. That was 1996 mentality. Get another call from my agent. He goes, you made it all the way up the chain, dude. You're gonna go meet with Lorenzo de Bonaventura, the head of Warner Brothers. And I was like, really?
I was the executive in charge of it for quite a period of time when I was Warner Brothers. John Peters came to Warner's and said, listen, I think we can put all these rights together. We put the rights together. Kevin Smith came in with a really great take.
Lorenzo was the first one to ever say this of everyone I met with. He goes, all right, well, what would you do differently? And I was like, oh. Well, I changed the title. It wasn't Superman Reborn. I wanted to call it Superman Lives. I thought that sounded cool, plus Fletch Lives had always sounded cool to me. So I was like, let's borrow that from Fletch Lives, call it Superman Lives. More of a like, yeah, that's more than Superman Reborn. Same idea, but to me, a little bit better. He's going, I want to send you over to meet with John Peters. I know who he is. He's a producer, you know, he's a producer with Peter Guber of Rain Man, of 1989's Batman, of course. His history is that he was a hairdresser, a stylist, whatever. I don't mean to diminish. He did hair, coiffes, whatever you call it. So he was a hair man, and he worked for Barbra Streisand. They wound up being in a relationship and stuff like that. He wound up being a producer. What an American dream. You go from Barbra Streisand's hairdresser to producing Batman.
I don't think people get over the fact that I started as a hairdresser, you know. If I went to Harvard, it would probably be less different.
Jon Peters comes in, I hear you've got to take on Superman. And I was like, yeah. He's going, okay, well, let me hear it.
Kevin came in. I felt free with him. He was kind of an interesting character. We talked about a lot of different things. He was such a nut, and he was so animated, and he talked a great game that I trusted him.
And he goes, okay, 3 things I want with this picture. I'm gonna send you on your way, you do your thing, come back. Number 1, I don't want to see him fly. I said, okay. Ever? He goes, no, I think it looks fake. I hate all that flying shit, so I don't want to see him fly. I was okay. Number 2, I don't want to see him in that suit. I was like, which suit? And he's going, that suit, the suit he's always wearing. I was like, Superman suit with the cape and the blue and the red and the yellow? He goes, yeah, I don't like it. His words, not mine. Too faggy. I said, all right.
You gave him some notes and you said, the 3 things I don't want him to fly. I don't want him in that costume.
None of that's true.
Okay.
None of that's true. Of course he has to fly. He always flew. Superman, you talking about? Of course he's in the costume. None of those are true. Is there a 3rd?
Number 3 is he has to fight a giant spider in the 3rd act. I said, okay, really?
And he has to fight a giant spider.
Well, that was a Thanagarian snare beast.
What is this based on? He goes, well, do you know anything about spiders? Spiders are the fiercest killers in the animal kingdom. You know, you got to be careful around spiders. So if you had a big one, imagine how deadly they are. I'm looking for my moment in this movie. Like King Kong when I was a boy and they opened up the gates and you saw the giant monkeys going, I want that, I want to open up the gates. And then you see this gigantic spider coming at him. Superman's got to fight the spider. It's a vision I have. I was like, okay, man, I'll spider it up for you and stuff.
If I remember correctly, I acted as the director for a while by bringing in people and starting to get some of my concepts on paper so that ultimately when I brought in Tim or whoever we brought in, I could sit down and say, okay, this is where we are, this is what we've done.
Jon Peters wanted to convince the higher-ups to invest in a movie that is going to have, you know, something other than another guy in spandex fighting Superman. My initial job was to come up with this big, scary freaking thing with a body kind of based on a Black Widow, but a face more like a tarantula. And I threw in maybe a little crab and stuff in there too. One of the illustrations was it was a Geiger-esque kind of thing, and it's what it called the opening of the Yanni. And all these little face hugger mini spiders are coming down and covering Superman, you know. He's not going up against a supervillain. He's going up against the alien or the predator or something that will try and kill him and maybe eat him or lay eggs in his eyeballs. That to me is super cool because it takes it to a different level that we haven't seen before, yeah.
This was all out of my mind. The Thanagarian snare beast, I stole it from Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, this giant squid who tries to swallow up this submarine. With the big snapping squid that was
giant nautilus. Yeah.
Yes, so Superman would fight every tentacle, getting closer and closer and closer to this beak till he killed it. It would have made an amazing sequence, amazing.
I appeased Warner Brothers by not calling it a spider. I called it a Thanagarian snare beast.
Another Hawkman reference?
A little Hawkman reference to the planet Thanagar or something like, just little things to throw in. And the Warner Brothers execs were like, as long as it doesn't say spider, we don't give a shit. We know it's a spider. Call it what you, snare beast? Like, come on.
And what made you want to tell the death of Superman?
I loved, you know, dramatic structures. So the idea was the death of Superman, chaos rules, really, I knew could be amazing. I just felt it in my bones.
They wanted to do the death of Superman storyline that had been done very successfully in the comics a few years before. Death and return storyline.
It was 1993, exactly 7 years since the theatrical and critical bomb Superman 4: The Quest for Peace. Superman comics were just not selling anymore, so DC Comics decided to do the unimaginable and kill Superman.
We had thought of doing the death of Superman before. We had sort of lightly kicked the idea around, and it felt like this could be the time to do it. My frustration in working on the comic book was that he didn't seem to have anybody he could have a knockdown, drag out, bash him up, take down half a city fight with. With Doomsday, we wanted a creature and a villain that was not cerebral. in any way, shape, or form. We wanted him to be a hurricane personified, a force of nature, a raging beast, because that's something that is very different than Superman. And that's what we wanted Doomsday to be.
It was one of those jobs where I was just like, fuck it, write your dream movie. You know what I'm saying? It's the dream job, go crazy, because whoever's gonna direct it is gonna change anything they don't like anyway. I had the Eradicator in there, I had Cyborg Superman, Lex Luthor was in there, Doomsday was in there, Brainiac was the villain. It was packed.
One of the things that your script actually brought in that now everyone's doing is the crossover. You actually had not only a lot of different villains, like Deadshot was in it, but you also had Batman.
That's right, there was a sequence where it was during Superman's funeral, very dramatic. It was clearly written by a Batman fan. It was almost the whole reason I took the job was just to write this cameo. It's kind of like Times Square, so they get TVs everywhere or whatever. And then like they all just go, they're just taking over and there's a big bat symbol and then he comes on and he gives them this message of encouragement. They're like, people of Metropolis, your hero is fallen. Like real fucking like wank stuff if you're a huge comic book nerd. Turn it in, Lorenzo's like, I like this. Basil's like, I like this. And you know, John, his people, like Tracy Barone, who was running his company at that point. Tracy goes, you're gonna come over tomorrow to have a meeting with John, right? I said, talk about the script? She goes, to read the script. And I go, what do you mean read the script? And she's going, he likes to have the script read to him out loud. And I was like, get out of here, man. You want me to like tuck him in after I'm done? She's going, I'm serious.
First of all, I'm not a good reader, number one. Number two, everyone sometimes reads things differently. But you can, when you see it, it's pretty much what you see.
I said, I understand I'm gonna read you a script. He's going, totally, let's do this, man. He lays down his couch, his tennis shorts on and stuff. And he's looking up at the ceiling and he goes like this. And he was making director hands as he was laying there. And this was the movie screen that he was placing onto his ceiling so that while I was reading, he was seeing it on a canvas.
I'm a visual guy. So most things I do by visualization. Every script I ever get, have someone read it to me. And I just, you know, lay back and listen, and I run it on my screen in my brain.
And at one point he stops, he goes, oh, nothing's happening. You got Brainiac coming to the Fortress of Solitude, there's no fight. Where's the fight? Fucking have somebody up there, man. Have him like Brainiac fighting Superman's guards. And I go, well, it's called the Fortress of Solitude. Like, fucking nobody's up there, dude. Like, he's alone. Plus, why would Superman need guards? He's Superman, dude. Like, think about it. And he goes, well, what about polar bears? And I go, polar bears? He goes, polar bears are the fiercest killers in the animal kingdom.
I'm sure there was 50 other ideas we could have come up with, but at the time, we wanted to animate those things or whatever we created as something that he could fight. And there's nothing more ferocious than a, 3,000-pound giant, 12-foot, 15-foot polar bear.
I remember reading a version. I don't know if there's two drafts that are of yours that are online. One has Brainiac going to the Fortress of Solitude, and there's two polar bears that just see him.
Right.
And I was like, are they the guards? And then he fucks one up, and then the other one skimps away.
That's it.
Okay, but then this one that I was reading earlier this week, and that has the polar bears just as statues outside. Because I was like reading, I was like, am I tripping? So I was like combing through it, like trying to find.
John. But I think it was, I don't know if it was Tom Masali or Lorenzo going like, why is Brainiac killing an animal? And I was like, because John thought that he needed to fight Superman's guards up at the Fortress of Solitude. And Lorenzo was like, why would Superman need guards? I was like, I know, right? But whatever.
Who else was on your plate for directing the Superman film?
Tim Burton was my #1 choice. And obviously I didn't want to make a Superman that anybody else had made. And I really wanted to run Superman through his brain.
But they were like, who do you see as director? And I was like, Tim Burton. Look what he did for Batman. I know this is a fundamental different character, but it's Tim Burton. You know, you can't go wrong. If you're gonna bring a superhero back to the big screen, he tapped him again. I had no idea when I said that. I was just signing my own. You're fucking fired, fat boy, Warrant.
Kevin handed in his draft.
Right. I called him and it just was no good. It wasn't funny, it had no structure to it. It was just unimaginative. He was like, it was an amateur writer. He wasn't a crafted writer.
What were your major influences? Like, what were your favorite characters when you were a kid, start growing up?
Well, I love movies, and I love mainly monster movies, and
Ray Harryhausen movies, but I guess the genre that, you know, horror movies, monster movies, science fiction films. I think my favorite, obviously, my favorite comic character was Batman. Just getting into the sort of psychology of the superhero. That was, at that time, you know, sort of new territory. And so when I got involved with Superman, it was just a different sort of, you know, sort of exploration of that kind of feeling of being different and feeling like somebody from another planet. And those kind of themes were always quite strong in old monster movies and in some of the comic books. You know, the graphic novel came into play, and the sort of psychology of the characters. And so obviously a lot of the comic book characters fit into that kind of mythology of somebody who doesn't, you know, fit in, who's somebody who doesn't belong. And that sort of exploration of feeling like an alien on a planet and being different and having to sort of hide yourself in some ways and suppress certain sides of yourself, and, you know, the sort of secretive internal nature of that kind of a character. So that I think was the thing that was, you know, the root of it was the most interesting.
Hearing Tim's inspiration for the character was a great moment where you were like, oh God. In a way, it's so obvious, but of course the best ideas are not that easy to get to.
When you give him the Thanagarian snare beast with all these characters, Tim Burton goes to work. He is such a visualist that he makes things happen through his mind, you know, that sometimes not even on the page.
There was a little school called CalArts that all of us guys were at way back in the late 70s. It was at Disney that we all went to following that, and Tim and I started to work together there.
Another project that Tim and I worked on together was an experiment with stop-motion animation for which I took Tim's designs and created puppets in three-dimensional sets.
It's basically the story of a little boy who thinks that he's Vincent Price.
I was just finishing up The Big Lebowski for the Coen brothers and got the call from the line producer. It sounded like a really great idea. It was going to be a somewhat different take on the myth of Superman. I had worked with other great artists. Those are guys that had been part of the Hollywood scene.
The day before I got the call to do this show, I just signed on to do the first Matrix. Then had to quit that the next day because I got the call from Tim. So I just immediately quit and said, no, I'm going to do Superman. I'd already done 2 shows for Tim. I'd done Batman Returns and Mars Attacks. Pete Von Schally was there doing monster and creature designs.
Michael Jackson, storyboard artist, gave my name to Rick Heinrichs because they needed a bunch of monsters for Brainiac's zoo. And I worked for a few weeks and just filled a wall with monsters.
Sylvain was great because he had that Mobius kind of feel to his work. He's French. He worked with and knew Mobius.
I remember asking Rick, are you sure I'm the right person? Because I grew up in Europe. My style as an illustrator when I was doing that work was mostly European. I don't have any connection with the American superhero comic book mindset. But Rick said, no, that's precisely what we want. He said, we've already got the guys who come from comics, and we want to diversify a little bit. We want to see what somebody who comes from Europe with a completely different take can give us. So I joined the crew and entered hell.
Veteran illustrator Jack Johnson was doing great gouache paintings for the production. Jacques Ray doing lots of beautiful concept design. Jim Carson was there.
We all worked together. Most of us worked in a bullpen. There was 4 or 5 of us. There was myself, there was Jacques Ray, Harold Belker.
Harold usually does ID design, vehicle design, so it would have been something of that nature.
What about Bose? Bose was in and out. He had an office down the hall.
Well, Rick Heinrichs, we got to know really well on Nightmare Before Christmas. He promoted me to be the assistant art director on that show, and then I moved to LA to sort of start my Hollywood career. Working on a movie lot, you know, from San Francisco, and this was like a big deal for me. It was a really great moment in my life. Stage 15 has an office upstairs, and at the beginning of Warner Brothers, the logo, you know, the logo, it shows that moment. It shows Stage 15, that balcony, so it's something that I always remember. Every time I watch a Warner Brothers movie, I'm just like, that's where we did Superman Lives.
I'm more of a nuts and bolts kind of guy. I mean, I, kind of run the operation. I make sure that the crew is there hired, that we're moving along at a good pace. You know, I got a little bit involved in more of the creative on this because we had a lot of R&D going on with graphics and also all the visuals that we were going to do.
I guess this was the late 90s, and we were doing a lot of things at that time. I mean, the business was absolutely exploding in its prime. This was kind of the genesis of when production companies were getting kind of savvy to the fact that they could get the best price and the best quality work out of companies like my own by pitting 3 or 4 companies against each other and basically creating a contest. They said, show us this crazy whacked out with some notes from Tim, the wildest, most iridescent soap bubble, light up Las Vegas sign arm as a test, as a prototype. And you can make a couple if you want. And so we worked and worked and worked and came up with a couple of these prototypes. I believe we did 3. They said, wow, this stuff's great. Nobody else came close to what you're doing. Tim loves them. Let's go. Let's take the next step. I'm like, well, I don't even know what we're building. What's the next step? Number 1, we had to work with Colleen Atwood, who always does Tim stuff, as a wardrobe designer. She's pretty amazing.
I met Tim on Edward Scissorhands, which was my first collaboration with him. You know, we just hit it off, and we had a good run on that. And then when Superman came up, it was, you know, a different kind of movie for me at the time to do. I hadn't ever done any kind of big, kind of superhero-y sort of things at all. With Tim, you always start, you know, with like who he thinks the people are, like his sort of take on it, which is always unique and what makes him Tim and special, I think. And his take on Superman was, you know, was a new kind of version of it. He didn't want to go with the sort of Mr. Clean version. He wanted to go with kind of this unnoticed kind of person.
So with Tim, you see this recurring theme of the outsider in a lot of his films. He's interested in characters who kind of carry this extraordinary capability or gift of some kind. You'll see this in a lot of his films. And how that character interacts with the outside world. They don't often connect well. Part of them needs to stay hidden because if you were to reveal their real self, it would be calamitous for that character.
Batman also had like a secondary role. He was Bruce Wayne, and then he was Batman. With the Superman character, there was Clark Kent. What was your take on Clark Kent?
Well, you know, like you said, slightly similar, but this is on a much grander, you know, this is like on a global scale in a way, in the sense of having to hide. And you always try to put your personal feelings into it. So I always felt like I was an alien. So I think a lot of people do, and a lot of kids do. So that very simple through line, that was probably the core thing in a way. That for me was, I think, the main thing that interested me.
All of us feel like aliens. Nobody is comfortable in their own skin all of the time. And we all feel that darkness. And I wanted him to be able to talk about that darkness in a way that would be interesting for the audience.
I think the humanizing of Superman was what I would look at as sort of Tim's approach to him that made me really get excited, made Warner's get excited.
I remember I was in Hartford, Connecticut doing press for Chasing Amy. I got the phone call. They just brought on Tim Burton. I was like, so do you think I get to stay on for the whole show? He goes, oh no, you're done. Tim Burton came on, he goes, I don't want to do the script. I'm going to do my version of Superman. And so I guess, I don't know who the screenwriter was, maybe Wesley Strick.
I got involved because I had worked with Tim on Batman Returns about 6 years earlier. I ended up staying for the whole shoot because he felt like he needed a writer at his side through the process. I remember him sort of complaining about making superhero movies. He compared it to Chinese water torture. And I asked him then, if you hate it so much, why are you doing the sequel? And he said, because I think I learned a lot doing the first Batman movie, and I want a second movie in which I can put to use everything I learned and sort of undo the mistakes he felt he had made in the first one. I knew that there was a Kevin Smith script. I read it without any preconceived idea about it. But as I read it, there was a lot about it that wasn't sort of clicking with me. It's because I'm not a sort of Superman fanboy. I hadn't read any of the Death of Superman graphic novels, so I wasn't up to speed with all that stuff. I was just sort of curious what Tim's take on it was. So we met, I remember we met at the Chateau Marmont in the lobby there. And I said, so Tim, I read the Kevin Smith script. And before I was finished with my sentence, he said, I don't want to talk about that script. I was like, okay. So what do you want to what do you want to do? And he wasn't sure. We also were told by Warner there were aspects of Kevin's plot, if not his script per se, that they wanted to keep intact. Obviously, it was still based on the death of Superman to some extent. John Peters was very much involved right from the get-go, and Tim was, I think, really ambivalent about that too. He had already had a sort of bad experience with Peters on Batman and told me that the reason he went to London to film it was to get away from Peters. And now he was making this movie, the Superman movie in LA, in the same city as John, and he was a little already uptight about it. I think he kind of could see the future.
John's a force of nature, and he's passionate about things, and that's, I think, where that sometimes where it becomes, you know, the problem. You know, it's like trying to control the weather. You know, it's kind of not, can't really do it.
You have to, you know, even though you're the producer, people just get mad at me. I'm controlling, overbearing, all the force of nature, all these crazy things, only because it takes tremendous energy to move most people who say it can't be done, and most people have no energy, into being able to see the same vision and then get the money to do it.
What Tim and I always discussed vis-a-vis Superman versus Batman was that Superman takes place in daylight, in sunlight. Batman came out at night. I mean, that was sort of the real sort of yin-yang of the two characters. And Tim was excited about doing that because I think he felt that a lot of his movies were sort of movies made in the shadows and darkness, right, and all of that. And I think he wanted to challenge himself to see if he could make a movie that was brighter, sunnier, maybe a little more optimistic than what he was accustomed to doing.
So you basically changed Batman. You were the one who came in and said, we're going to give Batman a brand new look. We didn't really have the internet back in 1988 when you were shooting this, so the grumbling, whiners, and complainers didn't get a chance to attack as hard as they do nowadays, where I just related to people like, you know, Nicolas Cage as Superman, what a weird choice, or the same could be said for Michael Keaton. It's
well,
really...
But that, you know, luckily, you're right, it was before the internet, but there definitely was, luckily it was here in England, but I know that I had heard there was a huge backlash to that just because they thought, oh, it was going to be like a joke. Even back then, luckily enough, you know, I mean, there wasn't the analysis that you get, because it's like, yeah, you know, picking, you know, apart the carcass before it's even dead yet, you know.
No, that's true. That welcome to the internet. That's 5,000 people all have solid opinions. Yeah. Yeah.
Michael Keaton had done a movie called Clean and Sober, which I saw, and I thought, this guy is a genius actor.
The shouting about Michael Keaton as Batman was so fucking loud and proliferate in 1988-89 that even though the internet didn't exist, the internet was still mad. Like, that's how fucking big it was. People were like, what, Mr. Mom?
I also want to say something in response to all the folks who kept those cards and letters coming, you know? All you got to do is tell me no, baby.
The reason he worked for me is that because, you know, he looked like somebody who needed to dress like a bat to intimidate people.
I knew, being a street fighter my whole life, that you can gauge the toughness of your opponent by the look in their eyes. And Michael Keaton had that look.
Lights out! Now you want to get nuts? Come on, let's get nuts.
I had just read The Dark Knight, the Frank Miller comic book, so I was like, I want a badder-ass Batman. I wanted a darker Batman. And I grew up as a little kid watching the Adam West Batmans. Right. And this Batman that came out was exactly what I wanted it.
It was, and it did almost $1 billion in those days, because we had a line where when he comes up, he says, I'm Batman. The line from the movie was, I'm Batman, motherfucker. And Warner's made me take out the motherfucker. And I wanted to do that because I knew the kids in the audience would go, yeah, all right.
There was lots of reasons why he chose, you know, Michael, and so I knew, you know, in my heart that we weren't making a joke, but there was. I mean, you're right. If the internet had been around then, it would have been. Well, it's like they just did. I mean, they just announced something with Ben Affleck. Poor guy, you know, it's like, you know, I'm sure he can handle it, but you know, it's tough out there.
Yeah, a lot of haters, a lot of little trolls hiding behind their little mom's basement.
All right, so you've got Tim Burton signed on. You signed on. You got Warner Brothers. You got the rights together. How did Nick Cage enter the picture?
He reminded me of Michael Keaton. They both had this, weren't the handsomest guys, but both had this tremendous, tremendous gift as an actor.
Now when you think about it, if somebody was like, would you like to see a Nick Cage Superman movie? I'd be like, fuck and yes, take all my money because I want to see what that looks like.
I was going to play Superman, and that fell apart for whatever the reasons. And then I saw that movie and I said to myself, well, that was a much more nostalgic, traditional approach to that character. And I didn't want to do that. I was going to turn that character upside down along with Tim Burton.
The great thing about Nick was that he was a fan of the comics, but he also was a fan of the sort of underpinnings and the psychology of it all. So that's again what's made it exciting. He sort of understood, to me, sort of both sides of it.
I think Tim looks at these things slightly off-center. You know, I mean, if you think about Michael Keaton, it's not the guy you would have thought of casting as Batman. And yet, when you saw it was great, you know. And I think when we first heard the Nick Cage idea, we were both intrigued and also going, well, that wasn't really the way we were thinking of it exactly.
I thought it was exciting that Warner's was sort of pushing the envelope and allowing not a pretty boy like Christopher Reeve.
I think that's what they were trying to do, is not have that squared off jaw like Chris Reeves or any of the other people who have played Superman in the past. They wanted somebody who was a little edgier.
Yeah, so it was your call to get Nicolas Cage.
Yes, it was my call, my idea, yeah. He could create a character that was an alien from another planet. So why couldn't he be a dark alien and light? I didn't want to make someone who was just pink. I wanted something for the street.
Because he's such an eloquent actor, he's got a very powerful presence. He can convey doubt and torment. He can convey joy and happiness and humor. And, you know, he's an actor.
And the Oscar is awarded to Nicolas Cage.
I know it's not hip to say it, but I just love acting, and I hope that there will be more encouragement for alternative movies where we can experiment and fast forward into the future of acting.
When you match that with this idea of making him a guy who has some insecurities, and Nick has that ability to play so vulnerable, it was actually a very natural fit to his take.
Casting of Lois Lane, some of the names that came up were Courtney Cox, Julianne Moore.
Courtney Cox I met with, Julianne Moore I met with.
And Sandra Bullock.
Sandra Bullock was our main choice. She would have made a great Lois Lane.
See, where was I? I must not have been in that day.
Funny, she'd do it today, but at the time she turned us down.
Chris Rock as Jimmy Olsen?
Yeah, I think we were talking about Chris. Yeah, I like Chris. Yeah, that sounds about right.
Chris Rock came into work one day on Dogma and was like, guess who's playing Jimmy Olsen? And I was like, you? And he goes, why not me? I was like, I'm just asking. I was like, that's awesome. He's going, just got the call today.
I had heard Jim Carrey as Brainiac.
Jim Carrey even born back then?
Yes. Was he? He was just played the Riddler in Batman Forever.
And I also had Sir Christopher Walken in mind for Brainiac.
One of the reasons why we all liked Walken was because he's both a very menacing cat, but he's also very funny, right? So there's a slightly off-centered quality to who he is.
Your daughter's screaming. Amy's screaming.
And Brainiac can come across, I think, very cold and very intellectual. The idea of embodying him with a guy like that who has so much bursting out of him.
Kevin Spacey, I know he had talked about Luther, and that's eventually Bryan Singer's.
Yeah, we did. We always thought he would be a good idea. He'd done a lot of movies at Warner's with us. He was definitely a favorite, and I love him as an actor. So it was sort of a no-brainer, that one.
Well, I always had a certain thing in mind, and talked to Kevin Spacey about Lex Luthor.
That is Lex Luthor.
Right.
The utter arrogance of everyone in this room is fucking beneath me. Like, what he has to be in behind closed doors is that fucking Kryptonian alien. Like, everything is dripping with, he's not one of us. Because that's the only way that he could possibly stand up to or over Superman.
Gods are selfish beings who fly around in little red capes and don't share their power with mankind.
So I had this sort of idea of kind of melding them in a certain way.
At some point, Brainiac and Lex Luthor merge physically, and Tim was like kind of doubtful about that. He said, isn't that going to be too much like that movie with Roosevelt Grier and Ray Milland, The Thing with Two Heads?
Like, that's when I read Lexiac, I saw, wow, that's amazing.
I remember I had a meeting with Kevin, and he's very good at doing sort of imitation, and did great Christopher Walken.
Now, Christopher couldn't be here tonight, Mike, but he did send the following telegram. Mike! It's crazy. You know, the AFI, it's an award. It's like the Tony, which I'm up for, and you have a bunch of. It's crazy.
Well, you're saying Christopher
But I wanted that's who I wanted. I mean, so when I get something in my mind, you know. But I also wanted Sammy Davis Jr. for Beetlejuice.
Wrong.
In terms of design, you always try to match the design with the cast and what you're going for, and what, you know. And I think, you know, nothing ever really got finalized because everything else was so kind of chaotic.
A lot of the Sort of guts of the story is about an evolution that happens to our main character. And we wanted really to show that visually with the suits.
A lot of people just jump to strange conclusions, especially like we have Troll Wars on the
We were
internet.
crucified for that. Tim always talked about it almost as though it was an alien that was cradling him and bringing him back to life after he dies, but it was a kind of a living organism.
Right. I think what happened with that, the Kal-El character, he had some kind of like robotic assistant that then when Superman lost his powers, or actually when he got killed by Doomsday, he had this like Kryptonian kind of regeneration suit.
Well, that has to be what this is then.
Yeah,
Look at me, I made it, and I don't know what the hell I'm talking about.
That was like the beginning of the regeneration suit as the layers went on in the beginning when he was in the tank. So it's kind of the idea of replacing neural and circulatory things in your body that were kind of under the fluid that could be laser driven and stuff without the kind of ecto layer that you saw through later on it.
So the first thing we did is we sculpted a suit, and we cast it in silicone, but we did it over Nick Cage's light cast. Kind of a biomechanical, much more standard-looking suit.
This is the vinyl casing that we've sewed on. We have a little bit of buckling here. I'll show you. Up, forward, that's where we're getting that buckling.
So we did this test on Nick with this basic solid silicone suit in New York, and it was a complete disaster. He hated it. I hated it. Tim hated it. Colleen hated it. Surprised they didn't fire me right there.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have the same
anatomical,
yeah, right, movement like the other ones.
Right. Yeah. Oh no.
It's not there.
And what's doing it? I think this stuff is.
You made a couple different things. You made the exoskeleton where he's like kind of in this fluid kind of regenerating, and then the robotic kind of those clear things.
And I want to see somebody wearing this. I'll make sure this is seen. You gotta see comfort. Speaking of background.
Oh, that's right, Nicholas. This is what awaits you.
Yeah, no buckling. No buckling. No filling, but no buckling.
The biggest problem with it is it's not clear enough, it's not alive enough, it's not iridescent enough, and hello, it doesn't really move very well, so how do we fix that? And I happen to have a fantastic team. I believe Lenny McDonald, who's a complete mad scientist in this business, and Bill Bryan as well, teamed up on this, knowing what was possible. We could do what we couldn't.
I first started working with Steve at Boss Films on Ghostbusters. He was in charge of Slimer and the librarian. I decided, you know what, how about I just take a bunch of those vacuum-formed pieces, go back upstairs to my loft and start messing with them.
Vacuumforming is you take plastic, heat it up, and then take suction and suck it around a hard plaster mold that we previously laminated with an iridescent material. Once that's set up, we could then vacuum it, and something interesting happened. The iridescent qualities become amazing, like an oil slick. And we had done this on the Abyss, and it looked really cool, so we thought, okay, that's step one, that's a soap bubble.
They had these vacuum-formed parts, and they were all in the places that need to move. And I started overlapping them and letting them slide against each other. Colleen, when she came in and she looked at us, hey, now this has got some possibilities. And then she had us develop it further.
And we literally took hundreds and hundreds of these beetle-like iridescent shapes. We sculpted all of these shapes, every muscle on the body, extending it a little bit further than you would need.
You know, came up with little clear staples to go underneath, and it was all held together with clear vinyl tubing.
Tied them together on Tim's recommendation because he wanted to go with little Edward Scissorhands, make it haphazard, so we had these weird tubing that was tying it together in a very asymmetrical fashion. We ran fiber optics and all kinds of patterns, sequenced them, laid into the Superman suit. You've got to know that number one optic comes out at number one port, number two through the hundreds of them, so that you can then pattern the shapes just like a Las Vegas sign.
That was a layered costume, so it was a sculpt of musculature with a sculpt of clear, almost like a plexi layer over it with etching in the plexi where light could pass through it and it would sort of have a glowing quality.
Which were powered with lasers, so it was really powerful stuff. It looked great.
Tim was not a comics geek. His thing was film, television, and he was able to synthesize a lot of what he saw into a Tim Burton look and feel. I've always admired the fact that he doesn't approach things with the same kind of reverence that somebody who loved the comics and loved certain things about them.
You know, every show Tim does, he initiates the show with
sketches, character designs, and they immediately give you a sense of where he wants to go and what he wants to do.
In your Tim Burton art book from your museum show, there's a big picture of Brainiac, like with green flames, and there's 3 characters standing.
Well, that was like a bit Wizard of Oz-y kind of.
What about some of those images that I saw in some of your artwork? Like he has like, he's kind of like, he was a supercomputer, so it's kind of like a greenish.
Yeah,
gray.
I don't know. I had a weird mixture of like that head in the ball at the Haunted Mansion. So sort of like a bowl, fish bowl kind of head kind of thing. But with like, if he had a cape on it, or he looked like he was human, but then he's like more of a spider. I think I was inspired by, the brain that wouldn't die, and there's a thing, there's a spider creature in Johnny Quest that I remember. A weird mixture of things.
I was given a sketch that Tim Burton did, which I thought was cool.
And the sketches that Tim does, they end up looking a lot like that in the film. It just was something I had never encountered before, and so I'm like, does he want me to make this stuff look real, or is he kidding?
So I kind of took that sketch and kind of made it a little more superhero-ish. It was still interesting. We actually nicknamed that guy Edward Supermans.
How did those characters like Brainiac come about visually for you?
Obviously, they're very crude. So the thing is like, that's why you find people to work with who something crude and then interpret it to something that's real.
Yeah.
Because to be honest, if things looked exactly the way I drew them, it wouldn't necessarily be so. Yeah.
One of the concepts we were pursuing is for Kal-El's journey that Jor-El provided with him a means to survive. And one of the main means for his survival in this new world was Kay. It was to be a companion for him throughout his life. Tim had a brilliant idea to have Kay start out as almost a teddy bear. Kal-El was a baby when he got into the craft to come to Earth, and as Kal-El grew in the spaceship on his journey to Earth, he'd have this little teddy bear, a companion, something to comfort him a little bit. And Kay had the abilities to morph and to change to suit his needs.
There was that through line with both Superman and Kay, like the whole Kay concept.
Going from the rejuvenation suit into basically, I guess, the Kay character kind of becomes his suit for a little bit.
We decided that it was protective. We didn't want another Superman suit.
That was pretty much all I heard. It's like Tim Burton, it's Superman, and you're going to design a suit that is going to replicate his powers. I knew that there was probably an element that he was healing inside it, regenerating possibly. That kind of put this notion of something that was maybe a bit Egyptian.
What about all the glyphs on his suit?
I thought of the hieroglyphs to give it a sense of age and to make it feel alien. And I probably completely ripped off Ridley Scott with that. The design I did was completely unwieldy and impractical, but it was always meant to be just a leap-off point.
We were kind of exploring a Gothic, Art Deco, New York-ish kind of a design language on many of those. Kind of different from the traditional guy flying with a cape. So that it was obvious that Kay had melded with him and become one with him and just assisted every part of his being.
Within the story, Superman, almost dies. He has a healing bath. He has a new suit at the end. So it was a big deal with costumes and studio and all that.
Here, I believe this one would be after the Kay suit disengages, and this is the reformed, newer version.
This is the new, darker Superman. It feels a little more organic than the suit, like it feels a little more exposed in a way.
This S kind of broke apart into almost like a boomerang.
Yeah, like weaponry. And the logo was really important. That logo had to break up into elements.
I've seen the Silver S, castings of it. How far did you get with that final outfit?
We kind of knew what the material was and the shapes and all that, but as far as really mechanically making all that stuff work, we weren't there yet.
Doing a good job of scoping it up in 3D, vacuum forming those. They vacuum formed them in clear, iridescent, reflective colors and shiny stuff.
This was going to have a super polished sort of feeling to it to show all the different definitions of the muscles when you moved and when you flew. It would look really cool because black is hard to film. So this kind of kicked back enough light that you could sort of see the body and kind of feel the movement a little bit more.
What inspired you for some of the designs of Superman's outfit, which was some are like super shiny and rubbery, and what were you going for?
Well, we were kind of into a new discovery, you know. We were looking for something that wasn't a leotard. We were looking for the definition of muscle, which was more kind of different than the original Superman that was more of that period where people didn't work out.
What she was doing also, using sculptors, they were sculpting this fantastic suit.
Everybody wants to know about the suit always. You get emails, I get emails all the time. Can you tell me about the suit? I never understood the fascination to suit.
She set up a team over there led by Jose Fernandez, who's an incredible suit creator.
It's a different kind of vision of what the Superman meant. So in this case, you know, he was cut, and so his suit had to fit and be a certain way. So it was a combination of Nick and sculpt.
Well, the first motion picture I worked on with Tim was Mars Attacks. So this was the follow-up to that. To have that, the suit play a part as the character goes through a transformation, I thought was really unique and something you really, I guess up to that point, you really hadn't seen in anything. Between that and the different incarnations of the suit, the biosuit, which, you know, a lot of people have speculated about, talked about. I'm glad you're clearing up a lot of those perceptions of it.
2 minutes in the movie, inside some kind of weird neutrino liquid bath. Yeah. You'd see this kind of electric stuff. That's it. Yeah. That's all you would have seen. It wasn't him flying around with a rainbow suit.
I know there's been stills out there from those tests, and the stills actually don't do it justice at all.
It's fantastic. I was referring to this footage as the Holy Grail.
It is like the Holy Grail.
So Nick, like movement and stuff seems pretty good. Huh?
Yeah, I mean, you were saying it'll feel a little looser the more I wear it.
Yeah, it's really tight.
This is great. Look at that.
Yeah. That's amazing. Wow.
That's the hardest thing.
Yeah, but that works.
You know.
Initially, I was really struck at how he looked in that suit. His physique, it was different than what we had seen before. Obviously, he's quite a lean fella, but there was a certain power to him as well. Obviously, their early test. It's about the giddiness, the excitement of Tim and Nick and their passion for it. And their first exploration of the character. That's what always got me excited.
Have we figured out what the suit is?
Remember we kind of talked about like a chemical like baby blanket or something almost, you know? That kind of, I wouldn't say has a life of its own, but it's like almost more chemical properties.
What did Nick say about pixie dust? What was he saying? Sparkle dust?
I love the sparkle thing. It has the imagination of the child. Sparkle dust.
Well, the blue had a metallic finish to it. That's what he meant. But he's a car guy, so they probably call it that in car world. That kind of ombre two-tone, when it changes in the light, it goes back and forth. We started with a darker blue, but because there was a black suit at the end, we ended up with a more kind of metallic feeling on the surface of the suit. So we tested a million different materials to try to figure out what to make it out of. I had guys coming in from 3M and all these places going, hey, we have this new product. It was really exciting that way just to see, you know, it's like industrial design almost.
With Superman's iconic kind of S-curl and things like that, were you going to go with like a bit, like the pictures that we saw were like obviously a test long hair?
Sounds good.
What about Clark Kent later?
Yeah, well you can just dull it.
We can just do something different.
No, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Well, that gives it that kind
That's
of
that thing
magical.
too we were talking, because we're talking about like when he's, that he's just more heightened, so
Yeah,
we
exactly.
would do,
And
Yeah.
this is nowhere near strong enough for all.
If that's what you like.
Yeah.
I'm happy.
I like to try that.
Oh yeah.
Try that.
I like the idea that it gets wild.
Yeah, well, it should. And in that comic, it's got a strength to it, you know.
I like it. I'm starting to get attached to this length. What do you think, too? I mean,
We'll get off of this after. We're here.
No, but we are here, so we might as well celebrate as much as we can. Yeah.
When they make wigs, they make them so that they can be.
Oh yeah, they cut it down.
But we could have made it into a nice S. We could have given a nice bouffant and big comb. I mean, we had so much at our disposal.
And of course, the Superman of the 90s, also a lot of people forget that the Superman of the 90s had long hair at the time. In the comic books, he had longer hair.
We looked at long hair, short hair, this thing, that thing. It's like your notes to yourself, you know? I mean,
The only thing is, like, What was wrong with the original costume was that he wore his underpants on the
I
outside.
know. We don't want to.
But maybe if they were darker blue, maybe if they weren't
That's
glaring red.
I always looked at Superman and go, can we get the diapers off of him a little bit? You know, it's like,
The red underwear on the outside, we tried all different ways to avoid that, actually, because people kind of tend to make fun of that element on Superman, like the old tighty-whitey kind of vibe. With superhero costumes, it's always about the crotch. There was a suggestion that the Superman wears like basketball shorts like the Lakers.
I don't even know where this came up, if I'm dreaming this, or they started mentioning like Shaquille or Neil, Kobe, the Laker outfits and doing it more like, so it looks like a basketball Laker, I don't know.
And you're just like, really?
That's
How does
a
that
horrible
work?
suggestion. I'm glad that they didn't go with that.
It went away.
What does the cape mean exactly?
I know. Well, that's that's another that's something that I was gonna treat it again the same way. Like it's just that's why we're here. We're see if we're.
That's kind of neat. It kind of has like a velvet look to it. It's just like a child's blanket.
We had capes in all different surfaces and colors. As the costume changed and evolved, then the cape could also go from light to dark and for different purposes.
One of the things that I tried to get Tim to do at the time, and we may have done it, was to create a character out of the cape. So that in situations that we was in, it became formidable. He could take that cape and he could throw it and bring somebody to him, cut their head off or whatever it is, as a weapon that lived and came back on him.
We know we're doing a fairy tale.
Yeah.
Like we don't take it too seriously.
Yeah.
It's not too much.
Yeah.
The thing we were gonna do, and obviously we didn't even get, we just had the initial thing, was to give it whatever that vibe was, but to make it him, and so whatever that was, and usually it takes you a while to sort of organically find what that image is,
right?
In terms of the texture of the costume, and all of that was just real initial stuff.
In the process of you making your film, you found that actual moment when Nicolas Cage was closing his eyes and doing it in the middle of a screen test, wasn't aware, he wasn't even posing or looking at the camera.
Yeah, I was literally going over the footage and saw that flash frame and I was like, oh my God, what is that? And I went to it and literally stepped through it and saw the half-eyed, like he's in mid-blink, and that's the picture that went all around the entire globe.
Bryan Singer would carry around that picture of Nicolas Cage that leaked, where he had the long hair. That was obviously a costume test. So people online don't even understand the beginning of the behind the scenes of how things operate.
To be honest, fair enough. I mean, like nowadays, I do stuff. If I want to practice something, or experiment, I just do it privately with my friends.
I think you want to see this.
Yeah,
in its entirety without it going into.
Did you design the S-Tank?
Well, we kind of took it off from the more modern ones where it's a little just sleeker.
Yeah.
Those are like Halloween, that's like kids playing,
Right.
and they didn't even know. Well, that's just that's the wig uncombed, and it's this and it's that. I mean, there's a whole bunch of
there's things called lighting.
No. I mean, I mean, it's literally like showing your kids' Halloween costume. Back then, you didn't really think about it was just for us, and we're now there's nothing that's just for you anymore. So that's why we do it. 3 miles under the earth in a bunker with only one camera. Yeah.
That's the whole thing. We would make it reminiscent of whatever we see on Krypton. That's the whole.
My father wore this cape. So
this cape was handed down to me.
Exactly.
This cape comes from a long line of Kryptonians who were at the top of their field in science and law.
And performing arts.
What was your take on Krypton?
Well, I mean, that was been interesting to explore, and had a thing with Brainiac involved with that I thought was interesting.
Tim had this concept of him as a creature, once again, who's able to plug in, hitting that biomechanical theme, who can also pass as human in some places and just be completely bizarre and alien in others.
Tim said he felt like Brainiac should appear as the Grim Reaper, and so we illustrated him that way. And he did a quick sketch, and Tim acted all that out. He throws back his cloak, and he reveals who he is and what he looks like. truly. And then we see that Spider-S form for the first time.
Did you ever interact with anybody from ILM?
No, we never saw their art. Those worlds didn't collide, really.
Warner Brothers came to us with the script for Superman Lives, I think sometime in '97. Tim had the ability to look at my drawings, which were done almost entirely with colored pencil and markers on scraps of cardboard and paper, and imagine how it would play in the picture. I kind of identified the sort of the three poles of design, and that was the core, the humanoid, and then the spider creature with this holographic head and the tongue, and then the sort of cloaked cobra Brainiac.
We were going to introduce the organic, technical, biomechanical look and feel into Krypton. The idea of, instead of space being depicted as this cold technological place, there were a lot of organic qualities to what we were designing that made you feel that it was beautiful, made you feel that there was something poignant that Clark missed out on in his life on Earth.
My little contribution was trying to figure out if Krypton's a sphere, it's a planetoid, maybe it's split into tectonic plates that maybe telescope up and down or shift or are constantly moving and reacting to the universe, and also the sort of Dr. Seussian pod shapes that maybe dwell underneath the tectonic plates as they move. It was just fun playing with the atmosphere and how that would work, and obviously a sphere is the perfect vessel to hold an atmosphere inside. My particular technique at the time, before computers, was to take black paper and draw with white or lighter colors onto it, so you're basically drawing with light and how light affects things.
Rick Heinrichs, production designer, wanted to stay true to Tim's design sensibilities. So we did a lot of bulbous, spherical things. And we were playing with some different color schemes that weren't always seen in film.
Let's go back and talk about your interior art that you did for Krypton, because that had such a different tone to it. What inspired you with those drawings?
I think that there's a sort of, and this is something I've felt on every movie I've worked on. It kind of has to do with jamming, like musicians. The idea is to sort of go beyond technique and just let yourself drift and see what the vibe is. And I think what was happening is Tim Burton was head of the project, in a sense, organically. The team that worked with him was people like Rick Heinrichs, but there was Bill Bowes, who was part of an entirely different team. That part of the team was bringing in a certain knowledge about how to make the idea of Tim Burton's world function in 3 dimensions in a fairly realistic world. That's all the inspiration we needed, was to go, okay, this is what you guys are doing, so what can we do to kind of try to blend in? So I think we were all getting an organic idea of what a Tim Burton adaptation of a DC comic might look like.
So this outfit here...
That was a Kryptonian party goer.
This kind of thing I saw on the Superman suit, like in the regeneration area. There was some kind of...
I tried to use elements that tied it together, so it was sort of from the pieces of things from the world.
It'd be cool, like on Krypton too, for somebody to have a piece of that, kind of to tie it in.
I did a lot of stuff to get a look for Krypton. So I used these elements on the Ecto thing done together as headgear and a collar thing. So I was just figuring out ways I could apply the kind of backing into the healing suit, the elements of that on the kind of pedestrians in Krypton. So she has the element of the hand thing on her foot.
I mean, it's an interesting exploration.
Yeah,
obviously never finalized it.
I just saw, like, some of the early designs had kind of a Mobius Giger type of biomechanical aspect to it.
Would that have ever, it might, who knows, after a couple more months, it might have turned into Logan's Run like jumpsuits. Who knows? I thought it might lose the tinfoil aspect of it. The Jiffy Pop. I always expected, like, Marlon Brando to just explode into popcorn.
With Tim Burton, we never really got far enough to develop the complexities about Krypton. However, that when Krypton blew up, hold on a second, just a second, pause for a second. Hello, I'm in the middle of this interview. What do you need? Yeah, do it. Okay. Hello? Let me just take this one thing real quick. All right. Everybody has heard about the guy. My guys know all about him. I would love to have lunch with him, or if you could set that up. Yeah. How much money did you guys raise for him? So I could put some in there if I wanted to? Okay. All right, I love you. Set this up for me. I really appreciate it. Okay, thanks. Bye. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Life goes on.
Sylvain was working primarily on the Skull Ship. He was doing concept illustration, beautiful pen and ink and watercolor illustrations, some done in marker.
This is one of the few times I remember Tim Burton, kind of interjecting privately that he wanted us to try and design something like an actual vessel. But Peters wouldn't have it. He had a National Geographic cover with an Australopithecus africanus, the Lucy thing. And I think he pinned it on our wall and said, that's a skull ship. I want a skull ship. Skull.
It obviously was a skull that floated in space, kind of like Zardoz, that big face that floats at the beginning of that. The huge eye holes are the ports that they look out, and there's like these little guys, these like little creatures about this big, and in scale, the eyes are huge. I did some sketch models of the skull ship out of cardboard really quick.
That was going to be built on Warner Brothers Stage 16, which is their biggest stage.
So we introduced some of the design elements from kind of a meld between Giger and Burton.
That segued into the skull ship being sculpted by Bill Bowes.
The skull ship itself is probably about this big, and then Rick wanted to have all this really cool like tubing and mechanical stuff on the outside, so him and I actually jumped in the car, got some parts from the train store, and we just started gluing things on, and it just sort of like took on its own identity.
The exterior of the skull ship actually was an incredible sculpture that I believe ended up over at John Peters' house.
Hey, Bill Bowes, I found the skull ship. It's right here.
In the original concept, Krypton blew up into thousands of little pieces. They all became colonies and all had their own monsters. All these monsters were in the skull ship.
Right, they were called the Menagerie.
The Menagerie. And it was like a zoo, and we had all these monsters that were in the back of that big skull ship, which ascended into Earth, which would have been amazing.
We did hundreds of designs for Aliens and Brainiac ship. We worked for months and months and months designing and got pretty excited about puppetry, strange hybrid blends, digital removal of certain aspects. Cary Gamble, which was a perfect choice from his Superman days, as an artist for the comic, designed hundreds of designs for us.
I spent several weeks just drawing these things. They put this little sign on the design room door that said Cary's Fortress of Solitude, because no one was allowed to come in there.
And then I went even a step further. I'm a huge Brom fan. I thought, what can it hurt to call up Brom and see if he's interested? And he was.
It was essentially a mad scientist, part of the alien race that was coming in, and they needed all these characters brought to life. So they brought me on board and just sort of set me loose to start creating. I could put a dark sense of humor to them, and there were elements, again, this is a mad scientist lab, so there was a lot of experimentation going on.
Brainiac had gone through and collected all these specimens, which is why he was coming to Earth.
This one where it's basically kind of like a giant dinosaur creature attacking Superman inside of a spaceship. Where's that from?
I just made it up. It was like they just wanted us to go crazy. They just said, just draw monsters. John Peters liked the ones that I didn't like. He would come in and look at them, and I would say, look at this, isn't this cool? He goes, yeah, I like this one here.
I think the nickname I heard for him was Loudmouth, because you could just hear the bellowing coming from all the way down the hall whenever he showed up with an army of women and children.
John Peters came by a couple times, and he had his own ideas.
He'd bring a little entourage of people in the room with him, and it was very disruptive, and everybody kind of went, oh, God, here he comes.
He'd bring these kids into the office who would look at our drawings, never look at us, and start commenting, going, oh, I like that one. I hate this.
Usually I bring my kids because I have, 4 kids. Because, you get very jaded in a studio atmosphere. It's very controlled. Most people are being paid by you, so most people love everything. Nobody really gives you an honest opinion. But kids give you a really good, honest opinion.
I would be working on, some of Tim's designs some days, and and Peters might come through the office, and he might see that and then say, well, we're not doing any of that. No, I don't want that. I want to see muscles.
Every once in a while, he'd come in and want to demonstrate some new jiu-jitsu move that he had learned in front of these women. So he would call Rick Heinrichs in the hall and wrestle him to the ground in front of us.
So one day, Rick comes into the art department and he goes, man, we just had a meeting with John Peters, and John Dexter, the art director, was trying to explain something to him, and he put me like in a headlock. Man, it hurt.
Because you being the producer, you come in, look at some art, and then,
choke them out,
choke somebody out. So.
Well, I was more of creating an energy of an action hero and a world that most men don't know anything about.
I mean, you get both sides of it. Sometimes you get somebody in a headlock. One time he kissed me full on the lips. Now, which is better? I don't know. I think I might have preferred the headlock, but, or kick to the face, but whatever.
I wanted what it's like to break your nose. I've been in 500 fights. To break your hands, to bleed, to taste someone else's blood. I wanted that in these movies.
It's shooting fish in a barrel, man. We take a paycheck from a studio. I mean, of course you can humiliate us. I mean, that's easy, I'd like to see him wrestle a shark.
I remember that John, at the time, he had like 3 separate houses up Benedict Canyon that he was renovating. Tim and I were always like driving up there getting sort of upset because you could never quite predict what it was going to be this time. It was always something. And then Tim and I got into a conflict with Lorenzo de Bonaventura. I've been told that Terry Semel had never read the script, and he finally did, and he said, what is this? I hate this. I was also told that Warner's was changing its strategy in terms of the slate, and they didn't want to like swing for the fences anymore. They had gotten burned on, I guess on Batman Forever maybe, or
Batman and Robin.
Batman and Robin.
Yeah.
And Tim has always been upset about the fact that the Superman project was doomed by Joel Schumacher,
yes,
who fucked up Tim's own franchise,
yeah,
and then fucked up Tim's Superman movies. Yeah. And one day Tim said, could you come over? This is like 3 or 4 months into the process, and I kind of said, what's going on? And he started in this sort of sheepish way to say, well, the Warner's brass and Lorenzo and Terry Semel, and I kind of interrupted him. I saw where it was going. I said, Tim, you're firing me. And he said, well, they told me to.
This is where it gets into that sort of gray area of studio, the black hole of development. It's the hardest thing to describe, but you go through it almost every time. Why? I don't know. It's just that I've been involved in so many scripts where you're fixing it, but you're basically just smothering the life out of it. And you go down that track, it's not a good one, but it happens a lot of the time.
He told me that they were going to hire somebody else, which was Dan Gilroy, I think.
The first meeting was at John Peters' house up in Bel Air, and we started talking about the current script, and it was the idea of going deeper with the characters and working on the action, and just it became sort of a sense that the script wasn't where they wanted it. And the next day I was at Warner Brothers going to meet with Tim at the production office, and it just became a daily, for the next year, it became a 7-day-a-week job. And I think what was brilliant about what Tim did and what he wanted to explore is to take a classic superhero character who is beyond emotional turmoil. What Tim latched onto was, wait a minute, he's an outsider. Because Superman is unique. He's not of the world. Batman's of the world. Spider-Man's of the world. All of the X-Men are of the world. They're mutants of the world. It was the emotional angst of somebody realizing that they are not of us. I think people who are drawn to fantasy very much are drawn to fantasy because it's literally an escape from the bullshit nightmare societal damage that gets created by growing up.
In the later draft that I have, Kay turns into Jor-El.
RK, I think, went much farther in the sense of saying that somehow there was a Kryptonian technology that imbued the essence of Jor-El, that went beyond just a projection.
I was playing with looking at owls as a kind of a touchstone, sort of like Brainiac was Cobra. I felt like Kay was Owl, and was designed to not only sort of nurture and envelop Superman when he was a baby, but to teach him, to train him, to befriend him. And literally, visually, after Superman is killed by Doomsday, Kay resurrects him and becomes the new costume.
I always felt that having Kay gave us some more physical presence of Jor-El.
Really, the focus was on Nick's character, on Superman and Clark and that part of the story.
I was thinking about when we left after our last meeting, Clark Kent in that T-shirt.
You know what, Nick? See, you had an idea, which this now, seeing you like this, the kind of mismatched kind of. Remember we were talking about more Wilder?
Well, we were talking about having like a Mickey Mouse T-shirt.
Actually, the T-shirt.
He's hearing other people making jokes.
You guys are the best.
It starts off with Clark Kent as a guy who works at the newspaper, but he had an apartment, and inside his apartment he had a separate place where it was sort of his changing room, it was sort of his little man cave. And I remember on the wall he had tremendous number of newspaper articles, and you could tell there'd been a lot of research that he'd done trying to figure out what might have caused his condition. That maybe this was some sort of medical condition that he had. So early on, when Lex, through LexCorp, uncovers the fragment of the spaceship near the Clark family farm, the second that Clark Kent realizes that he's an alien, it is utterly devastating emotionally to him. And these are the things that dominated the conversations that I would have with Tim.
Both Tim and Nick had this idea of like, Clark Kent was going to be a bigger freak than Superman, almost. Like, Clark Kent would be the alien.
It's a combination of wanting to hide and also
Superman and Superman.
Look good in Minnehanas on your day.
Superman and Super Freak.
Yeah, I guess the equivalent of Clark Kent now would be those guys like in Silicon Valley, like those kind of brainy guys that are sort of, who knows what their secret life is.
Nobody would think this is Superman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're also dressing like one of these guys at these science fiction conventions.
Yes, Lois to join go to Perry White's journalist convention.
Journalist of the year.
Who's going to get Journalist of the Year? We're both up for it, Lois. And it's you. You're Journalist of the Year.
It's a love story, and we tried to make it as simple as that. But he was and did have a dark side, like many men do. On the other hand, he was extremely vulnerable because he didn't really have anybody and he was alone. She gave him the strength of feeling, you know, like that he was who he was and that she loved him anyhow.
The relationship we established early on was stalled. He had this deep concern. What if we have a baby? What if this baby punches its way out of you like Alien? What if the baby kills you? He doesn't share this with it, but you can tell this is the dilemma.
You know, he was going to get engaged to Lois, and he was sitting in a restaurant, and he was literally pumping his leg like this, you know, and the water in everybody's table was shaking. He's so anxiety-ridden that he leaves the restaurant. I think I was at the top of a building, and then he just flew around the building like 30 times trying to burn off steam.
He doesn't change his suit. He doesn't look for a phone booth or anything. He just burns out of his suit. He takes off, and that in itself is enough to just, you know, shred the clothes. Tim wanted more of a visceral, physical punch that you saw in those Max Fleischer cartoons, which is sort of a adaptation of what Siegel and Schuster's original Superman was. That was our Kal-El, that was our Superman. He's not somebody you could fly. Tim said he did like the idea of this sort of magical flying, of just floating in space. And so he said he wanted to ground it and tie it to physics. And so if he jumps 3 miles in the air, he comes right back down like a bullet. The first thing I'd done for that was to do almost a Superman, a parkour sequence on a grand scale. So it shows Superman leaping across the city. It might take him 5 or 6 leaps, but he makes, you know, each leap being the equivalent of 2 miles or 3 miles.
He's much more interested in like somebody flying through the clouds and, you know, feeling the texture of that on their face. For me, it was very important was the idea of whatever is going on, the feeling of what it would feel like to be like that kind of a character. So it was trying to get more into that, the sort of visceral feel of it, you know, no matter what other, you know, bullshit was going on.
How do you make flying cool and also affordable?
ILM got involved. They were going to do the visuals on the movie, so they ended up coming down and we did some tests of just shooting this stuff and then figuring out how the cape was going to fly.
We did a lot of testing with that, and I think You know, for the time, the guys came up with some really great stuff. It was pretty exciting.
It was still early in the process, and we had some evolution to be done to the techniques that Tim was going for, but we were going to get there. Then watching Nick Cage in an outfit land, it was kind of like, whoa, there's Superman, the Nick Cage version. That moment I remember really acutely because it really was like, wow, oh, we really are doing this, you know, here we are.
So there was a lot of like at odds between the studio, the producers, and ourselves, which is like, well, you know, there was a push to have like Superman having a lot of like kung fu fights, and it's like, well, he's not gonna get into a kung fu fight with a bunch of ninjas, and you know, no, yeah.
There's this whole sequence of Luthor's henchmen polluting the waterways of Metropolis, and Superman at some point has to contend with a group of ninjas. I think they're there as sort of let me stop and go back. I'm just trying to think what they were there for. I don't remember.
They had just seen The Matrix, and they were like, we won! I
really don't even remember.
You're the one! Superman's like, I'm not Neo.
I think I thought it was just absurd.
We went scouting. When we decided on where we were going to shoot, you know, a lot of the exteriors, most of it was going to be done on stage, obviously. And we ended up going to Pittsburgh, and Tim fell in love with it.
Pittsburgh, I don't know, just had an interesting feel to some of it, and felt kind of right.
A lot of our ideas were all about getting these locations and expanding them, extending the sets with visual effects.
There's the PPG building that was going to be Lex Luthor's place, you know, his lair.
Lex himself was going to appear almost at one with his office that way.
We wanted similar proportions to the Daily Planet. So it was kind of the counterpart, more gothic, more weighty, you know, slightly more villainous.
What about Perry White's office?
Instead of it being the cliche newspaper office where it's basically the floor and surrounded with the editor's offices, we wanted Perry himself also to have a kind of vaunted sense of himself.
My last interaction or crossover with Superman was when we were making Dogma in 1998. We were in Pittsburgh. And we went to use a building for our movie corp. And they're like, you can't use that, that building's being held. And I was like, for what? And they're like, that's gonna be LexCorp in the Tim Burton Superman movie. And I was like, get out of here.
I knew Tim Burton loved kaiju and Godzilla stuff. Doomsday can be our sort of kaiju, our sort of Hulk plus thing. So what if this is a thing, an organism that destroys, but it propels its inanimate matter with an engine of energy. So this rock creature punches you with laser rocket power driving the punch, and it's sharp, then maybe I kind of create a power source. Is it some sort of energy core in the middle of it? Maybe it's exoskeleton. Let's also take it out of human anatomy and give it a second pair of arms.
And Doomsday was supposed to be cut in half by some big ventilation fan or something under there. And so we were doing some designs where like he's cut into two pieces, but then they sort of form two Doomsdays, and then they sort of meld back into another one. In the comic book, he was more of a big muscular thing with kind of bony protrusions. And I tried to get a little of that into the concept, but they really just wanted a big monster.
I don't know what stuck. I mean, we were all over the place. You know, so many hundreds of designs done. I was reacting to what Tim put down initially. He gave me a sketch of a creature that had multiple, his entire body was covered with faces and heads. And he explained that during the fight, some of these faces and heads would morph and change into people that Kal-El, that Superman knew personally. It would be somewhat unsettling to be fighting a creature and all of a sudden you see Lois Lane's face there, or you see Perry White's face there.
The one thing that I was really interested in seeing the designs develop was the Superman Doomsday battle in the subway. I think it was underground. A lot of it happened underground, and just the real feeling of power and force and strength and destruction. The concept designs for that scene were quite striking.
The fight with Doomsday was chilling, because you had this guy who you'd been tracking for the first 50 pages of the movie, and you knew emotionally he was dead. he was emotionally devastated. You could see the fight, as the fight was going on, that he was losing. And you could see that it was just all being taken away from him. And again, it just goes to this emotional power that comes from this decision, this primal decision that Tim makes to want to go this route. And I remember writing the death scene. And I remember as he's dying, I remember a part of me was thinking, there's a part of him that wants to die. There's a part of him that wants to let go. And I'll tell you something else that's interesting. Princess Di died right while I was writing that sequence. And John Peters called me up and said, you got to come over to the house.
I said, just copy what you see on TV and write it into the script. I wanted the grandness of a world weeping.
We were watching the processionals and the funeral, and that very much dictated how we saw the death of Superman.
We had a kind of almost a severe fascist or constructivist approach to the Superman tomb. In the scene that takes place, it was originally going to be at the Fortress of Solitude. At the time that the plug was pulled, we were considering it being in Superman's tomb, but this was the resuscitation of Superman.
What kind of brought Superman down?
I don't think there's any one reason. As always, there's usually a combination of reasons, and everybody will have a slightly different perspective. As somebody inside, Superman got caught at an unfortunate moment in time in the Warner Brothers.
So when you're working on the script, people are checking in with you on almost a daily basis. It was a studio movie. It was a huge budget. I think they had a release date. Before we handed in our first draft, nobody was talking about money in terms of the budget. It was just like, this is a big movie. We're going to write this big. I got a phone call that Warner Brothers had run a budget. It was through the roof.
It would have been $200 for the movie, another $100. It would have been a $300 million investment.
The budget was not an insignificant budget. It was a really large budget.
There was a period of 4 weeks where it was like, we got to retool this again and make this smaller. It's too expensive. We have to start cutting things. And these big Hugh Jackson sequences that before I had a blank check attached to them, suddenly it was like 14 buildings don't go down. We're going to keep it inside the 5th floor of this one building, and the Fortress of Solitude gets jettisoned. Everything goes into the tomb, and it was very much always in flux.
Development hell doesn't happen with no-name directors. It happens only with famous directors that a studio doesn't dare break up with. And that's how you end up for 2 years just, polishing a turd until finally somebody walks away at great cost.
We had several films fail right around it, or underperform right around it. So suddenly the economic pressure on all of us was very significant.
In the conference room at Warner Bros., there's a big board, and it's literally the size of a wall. And it has their entire release slate for the year, including all the other films that are coming out that weekend. So it's broken up by weekend. Warner Brothers got on one of the all-time terrible roles. Bob Daly and Terry Semel were in charge of the studio, and they had a tremendous run. These are very talented people, but at this point, for some reason, things were misfiring. And you could just see, it was just like every week the horse race was happening, and their horse was coming in last. Right. Big movies. So as we're coming in to discuss at the conference table our incredibly large budget film, with a Tim Burton take, which is deconstructionist and unusual and unique. What's going on around us is you're looking at the board and going, you can just see the bombs as they're going off. Every time I'd come in the conference room, another executive had been fired. And as you know, because from a human nature standpoint, when money starts getting tight and people have to make big decisions, safety becomes the big thing.
The risk that you can take when you're feeling confident is very different than when you're feeling a little bit on your heels, and we were on our heels at that moment. We were all interested in getting the script better, as the filmmakers were too, and it was still in process.
Lorenzo's utterly right. It's like we needed to work on it, we needed to hone it, we needed to make it better all the time, but it was enough there that you could see what it was going to be.
Dan Gilroy gave it some real shape, and I kind of liked what he did. The studio didn't like it.
And there was nothing, you never felt you were on solid ground when you were going in to talk about the script, because there was always the sense that it wasn't even a blinking green light. It was a green light. They were moving ahead.
I think the day before it shut down, I think Peter's assistant came by the art department, and he said he needed the skull ship model for a meeting, and so we all thought it was strange because they just finished that model, and so he took that model that evening. That was at the end of the day. I think the very next day, we got word that the production was shut down.
We built this test suit just for one of the people that worked in my studio. And by the time we got so excited that we were ready to explode, spontaneously combust, because we thought we'd come up with exactly what Tim wants, and something pretty damn unique, we got the call that the show was off.
Everything had finally come together, and we were ready to go to the next step. Actually, the day of the camera test was the day that they came and told us the movie was off. So we only had elements of that costume to camera test to make sure we were, you know, it was all visually strong. So we never got to make the whole thing. It's the one costume I've never gotten to really make that I've always thought would have been, like, amazing.
We were literally 3 weeks before production. We were ready to go. We were full amped and ready to roll. It was like getting run over by a car.
That afternoon, they called us all in, and I remember Tim and I and John went in, and we sat with Bob and Terry and Lorenzo. And it was look, we're talking about this and we're talking about that, and the studio cannot sustain this film at this point, and they pulled the plug.
Terry Samuel came up, we did a show and tell, showed him everything that we had, the script, the storyboards, all the stuff, and he was my closest friend, and he took me in the room with Tim, and he said, we're gonna cancel the movie, we're gonna shut it down.
So we were being asked to spend a lot of money at a moment in time where we were a bit ahead of where the script was a bit behind where we were spending the money, and then we had this overall pressure going on within the corporation. And so I think it's really 3 different sort of things were happening at the same time. I don't know that you can say that's the one, but they were. And you know, it is a financial reality when you're inside a company. When they're worried about their results, they look at the risk factor in a different way.
I was angry, frustrated. I felt betrayed, but it was their call.
What would you say are the top 3 reasons they pulled the plug, and what from their perspective?
Budget, Nicolas Cage, and Tim Burton. I think they didn't totally believe that Tim could make a Superman that would be, you know, commercial. People were scared of this movie, just like they were scared of Batman.
Whether it was they were still sort of still freaked out about my Batman, you know, Batman Returns or whatever, or whatever the dynamic was. And I think I've had this happen from the beginning. It's like they okay, yeah, do it, but then they're always slightly worried about you in some way.
Highly creative people have a hard time getting the movies made. Full stop. That's all it is. Because they bring stuff that blows everyone away. And as much as they claim as they want original, they're terrified of it. That's what happens. So you don't see those movies because they scare everybody up the chain of command.
You know, like when you have a transplanted organ, the body either rejects the organ or not. You have to have somebody in the body that says, no, I want that liver. And usually with these dangerous movies, people are kind of going, I don't know.
And John is a tremendous, passionate believer and proponent of the franchise, and he fought like hell for this movie.
Oh, I went in Terry Samuel and I threatened him with throwing him out his window. I mean, I was like, you can't do this to me. I've worked on this for too many years. We're ready to go. We're cast. We have one of the great directors who just made $1 billion franchise for you. Roll the dice, man. Roll the dice. Nope.
So that year that you were on working on Superman Lives, how much money was spent?
I think it was somewhere close to between 10 and 12 million. And then I don't know if there was ever any payoff to Tim or any payoff to any, Nick Cage or anything, because I don't know if they had a play deal.
Tim was completely devastated. He ran out. He wouldn't talk to me or anybody for a week, a month.
Where the studio was, John, the studio, me, the combination just was, But it is pain. I have to say, it is painful to work so long on something.
Once that was over with, and I couldn't even get Tim on the phone to try to figure a way to get it going again, because I wasn't going to give up on it until I got it made. Will Smith said yes to Wild Wild West, and we went off and began, shooting that movie.
That was another big film that Warner Brothers was developing, quite expensive film. And we kind of got a sense like, okay, we're gonna now focus on that.
No, they actually mentioned in the room while they were pulling the plug that the funds were gonna be going over to Wild Wild West. And that is its own story.
That's a whole other
story.
Documentary.
Yeah.
I went to a movie theater years later to see a movie called The Wild Wild West. All of a sudden, the Kenneth Branagh character shows up like in this gigantic metal walking spider, this monster spider, bigger than fuck.
I was so caught up with this spider and the Thanagarian snare beast that we did a comedic version with Wild Wild West, and that's where the spider came in.
And I remember John Peters' name in the credits. I was like, God damn it, that motherfucker finally got his fucking spider.
Now when I go to conventions and I show people, I'm actually doing the opposite of Bryan Singer. I'm doing like, hey, come here for a minute. And I show some fan who's like, Nick Cage is stupid. He would have been horrible in that movie. Check this out. Whoa, that's not bad.
You know, that character is such a bullseye that you have to hit. He's almost, you know, he's one of the most precious icons of our country. And the fact that Tim and I were pretty far down the road designing it, and I know with Tim and where I was going to go, we would have done something really special. At least it's out there in the ether that that could have happened, but it doesn't have to, we don't have to make the movie. It's still interesting to people.
You know, from that perspective, it was a big disappointment because I think he would have really stretched in a way that he hadn't yet. And maybe hasn't since, I don't know. He hasn't really made that movie.
When Superman Lives ended, obviously it was a very dark time, you know, to have something that, for everyone that worked on it, it's a horrible thing to be working creatively on something and then have it just kind of pulled from your life.
It's just, you know, amazing to me to look back that way and look at what's going on now with these kind of movies and wonder what that would have been then and what it could have become.
It's just something I think people should know, that they're looking at a process, not a product. Right. The ultimate product would have been an amazing film.
I don't know how it couldn't have been at least received very interestingly, because it's a movie I'd still like to see. And plus I would have been able to do a lot of cool monsters in it.
That was a big part of who I am today. That was the moment, like going out there and telling that story over and over again. Because of Superman Lives, that was when I realized my true talent, I think. You know, it obviously wasn't writing Superman. It was talking about writing Superman. That was where the real money was, I guess.
I think it would have definitely established the fact that you can make a tough guy have a great deal of insecurity.
It might not have been the comic book Superman or the television Superman or Dick Donner's Superman, but Tim Burton's Superman would have been something quite unique and probably something we'd still be talking about, you know. Oh, well, we are talking about it anyway. It didn't even get made and we're talking about it.
Tim is really, I gotta be honest, I think one of the only people who could really do it justice because he understands it. He's lived it. And he, man, he would have fucking knocked it out of the park.
I think it would have either been laughed off the screen or a big hit. I think Tim Burton would have made a movie I would have been proud of. Would it have done these kind of numbers that we needed to do? Maybe not.
If we had been able to strip through all of this sort of chaos, I think we could have had an interesting movie because it would have had some cool imagery and Superman be Superman, and then also experience what it's like to be hidden and to be that character. I mean, all those things were that was the core essence of what we were trying to do.
So, any final thoughts on Superman Lives? If you think back about it now, how do you feel about it?
Why are you trying to depress me so much? Does anybody got any cyanide or anything I can take? Visit me when I'm about 90 and I'll be here. Still gonna make it. Gonna make it.
So, okay, well, like with Nicolas Cage, were you going to go with...
What year is it now?
It is 2014.
And I'm still working on this project. It's interesting.